I've named this panel after the book that I co-edited with Karen Carrington, and that's a collection and anthology that addresses both the nature of terrorism and what our response to it, to some degree, ought to be. So, I think the panelists that are here can really have the capacity to expand our idea of what terrorism is. So, by including more categories than simply who we call, Al-Qaeda or IS or whatever group of terrorists from the Middle East are threatening the United States. That terrorism is an experience that many more people on the earth have than just Americans. So I'm going to start by, we're going to start with Mark Danner. I'm going to let people come in. Great. Shut the door. Good. Okay. Now, you probably all have heard of Mark Danner. You maybe don't. Maybe he doesn't need an introduction with a lot of you. He's one of the most well-known reporters who's been reporting on conflicts in Central America, Haiti, the Balkans, Iraq, the Middle East. He's written a number of books: The Massacre at El Mojote, Torture and Truth, The Secret Way to War, Stripping the Body Bare, which is an anthology of writings from various sources. He's remarkably prescient. He's courageous. He tells the truth. He's courageous not in the sense of going into combat zones, although he's done that, but he's courageous in the sense that he'll tell the truth in an atmosphere which is often quite hostile to the truth. And he has penetrating insight, and he's also somewhat prescient. And I wanted to quote from this article in which he writes that the problem with our response to terrorism is that our sensibility, our understanding, our political understanding of what's going on in the world is way beyond our technological proficiency, which I think is very important. It holds. He wrote that, you wrote that in 2011, no, 2001, didn't you? When was it that you wrote that? It was very recent, it was very long time ago.
You know, I may be prescient, but I don't remember that quotation at all.
I've got it
So I guess I look forward and not back.
I've got it here somewhere, so I'll find it. But the point is that it's still going on, and I think it's at the heart of the matter.
Well, thank you. Thanks very much, Susan. Whenever I get an introduction like that, when I find myself wishing my mother was here to hear it. So thank you for your generosity. And I want to thank you all for being here at the first annual Bay Area Book Festival. I'm very excited that this is starting, and appreciate all the work that Sherilyn Parsons and other people did to put this on. I think events like this are enormously important. It's kind of strikes me at its best, a kind of civic festival in which people get together and discuss the vital issues of the day. And there simply is not the opportunity to do that there should be in our society. So I'm very glad this is happening. I wish it happened more regularly. So that's the happy part of my remarks. Terrorism, we've been living for the past now nearly 14 years under the post-9/11 regime. I've called this, I'm not the only one, but I've written about it as living in the state of exception. The state of exception being a broad term that includes within it martial law, state of emergency, and other terminologies or other expressions that simply indicates we're living in a different time in which our rights and liberties are constrained because, at least the phrase is, because we're at war. Now, this is not the first time in American history this has happened. This is probably the 5th or 6th time. There's a wonderful book by Clinton Rossiter called Constitutional Dictatorship, And he talks about the particular things that happen at wartime. And we're talking about the Civil War, the Revolutionary War, World War I and II. And each time the presidency grows in power, dramatically in power, people's rights are constrained in certain ways. But the interesting thing about these periods of constitutional dictatorship, and these go back certainly to the Roman Republic, and I'm sure earlier still, is that they end. They come to an end. We define the state of exception as an exceptional state, obviously, something that is concluded. And what's interesting about the time we're living now, it seems to me, is that there is no sign of an ending. That this exceptional state that we entered in the aftermath of September 11th, 2001, not only is going on 14 years later, but we can expect it to go on for years longer. We have begun, as everyone knows, what might be called the Fourth War. There's the first war against Afghanistan, which has not yet concluded. The second war against Iraq, from which the United States withdrew its troops in 2011. There is the third war, which is the drone war in South Asia, Yemen, and Somalia, which has killed approximately 4,000 people to date, probably a quarter of those civilians. And now we have the fourth war, which is the war against the Islamic State, in which the United States has sent 3,000 troops back to Iraq, has conducted about 4,000 airstrikes on Iraq, targets in Iraq and Syria, has probably killed 500 to 1,000 civilians. It's very hard to get anything resembling accurate numbers on this. But this fourth war, and the third and fourth wars, it looked like can continue into the indefinite future. And as long as those wars are going on abroad, the accompanying constraints on civil liberties at home will continue. We had a remarkable event this past week in which finally surveillance, that is bulk collection of Americans' telephone calls, was finally slightly, and I emphasize slightly, curtailed in the United States Congress, very slightly. Symbolic action, largely, but perhaps an important one, and that finally the boundaries of the national security state have been halted in their expansion. Whether we should be optimistic about this or not, time alone will tell. So that is where we are. We're in an endless state of exception, which itself is a kind of a paradox. I want to say a word about terror itself, because as Susan introduced the term, as we're following the title, Transforming Terror, we're talking about a particular use of the word, which I think my distinguished co-panelists will use in different ways, and I want to talk about the way that I'm using. I'm trying to narrow it down rather than expand it, and I brought a definition there. You can find 100 definitions, literally, by the way, of what terrorism is. I'm using it in the narrow sense. Here's a State Department definition. The premeditated, politically motivated violence perpetrated against non-combatant targets. So if you put a bomb amongst a bunch of soldiers, even if you're surprising them or whatever, that's not terrorism. By subnational groups or clandestine agents, usually intended to influence an audience. So you're using killing, destruction, mayhem, large-scale death to achieve another aim. It isn't about the killing itself. And I think the one point I'd like to make, I don't know what our time constraints are here, but we're limited. The one point I want to make about our particular so-called war on terror is that it has been self-defeating. That is that we tend to have done the things that our adversaries have wanted us to do in attacking us. On 9/11, Al-Qaeda attacked the United States in order to draw the US, and this is documented, this strategy, to draw the United States into a war in Afghanistan. They wanted a long-term occupation of Afghanistan that would be similar to the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. They would get the United States mired in a war there and destroy the United States as they did the Soviet Union a little more than a decade before. In the event, the United States did al-Qaeda one better by occupying not only Afghanistan, but Iraq. And this was a much better thing from the point of view of al-Qaeda because Iraq is a country much more central to Islamic and Arab world concerns. The United States not only occupied Iraq, but began wholesale repression of the population, which provided brilliant televisual images throughout the Middle East, raised al-Qaeda's profile, and essentially the United States became the caricature that al-Qaeda had created of the United States, which is a blundering, repressive, oppressive, mutilating, killing superpower intent on destroying, humiliating, and emasculating Arabs. The United States did that, it became that, it thereby helped spread this movement dramatically, and secondarily created the Islamic State. I mean, if you had looked on the day after September 11th and said, you know, what a horrible thing, what will happen over the next 15 years? And someone had said, well, I think in 15 years, al-Qaeda will still exist. You'll have allied movements of al-Qaeda, very strong ones in Yemen, in North Africa, in Nigeria, in Somalia, in Indonesia. You will also have an Islamic State made up in part of Islamists and in part of Baathists that will be occupying a third to a half of Iraq and half of Syria, and presiding over 6 million people, population roughly that of Denmark, run by the Islamic State, which is so-called a terror state, then I think anyone who would put that scenario forward as the immediate future would have said, my God, that will be a disaster. And I think that is where we are today, as well as domestic surveillance and other things that we can talk about and will talk about, I'm sure, related to the state of exception. That is where we are 14 years later. And that is what we've done when it comes to transforming terror.
Yes.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mark. That was wonderful. And by the way, I agree with you about limiting the definition also. Paradoxically, when you limit the definition, then you expand the number of examples. So really what I meant to say is we need to expand the number of examples that and I found that quote, by the way, and I just have to, America's power has been technologically robust and politically fragile. And you saw all of this in October 2001. This is from an article, so, you know, thank you for that. Thank you for your continued voice. I want to introduce Claudia Bernardi. Claudia, she's going to show us something wonderful here, but I first have to introduce, let you know something about Claudia. Claudia is an extraordinary artist. The cover of our book, Transforming Terror, comes from her work. Do you have that image up here? Okay, it's coming. She's an internationally known artist, extraordinary artist, which you'll see from the one piece of her own work that she'll show you. Her work has been exhibited at galleries and museums all over the world, and I'm just going to name a couple of them. One is the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and the other is at the museum at Hiroshima. Recently, she's been focusing on community and collaborative art projects, working with and in collaboration with communities that have suffered state terror, violence, and who are victims of human rights violations. And that work is incredibly powerful. I just want to say a word about how she got involved in that. She lived through the Argentine military junta from 1976 to 83. In 84, she joined the forensic anthropology team, which was then led by her sister. Is it still led by your sister? Or? It changes, but she's still part of it. And that is, among other things that group does, is it exhumes the remains of people who've been massacred to try to piece together what happened and bring justice to those who were affected and to the entire nations. And part of her responsibilities included the creation of maps, from which then she created this beautiful, her own art that was very moving. And she realized from that art can be very, very effective politically in educating, in her words, educating, elucidating, and articulating the communal memories of the survivors of human atrocities. And just to add one thing, both Claudia, in different capacities, and Mark were working together at El Mojote. That's where you met. And if you don't know what El Mojote was, it was a massacre that occurred in Salvador. There were only, actually I thought there was one, but there were two, as I read further, two survivors. One, a woman named Rufina, who lost all of her family, and then the other was a young, who was a young boy. And, but Rufina was able to give testimony about what happened. So I'm going to turn the microphone now over to Claudia. Do you want this one? Yes.
I guess so. Thank you very much for being here, and thank you to the organizers and to Susan for the invitation. I should also tell you that I'm hugely intimidated by being in this panel. I'm not a writer. I'm a visual artist, so maybe this is an opportunity to see two worlds coming together. But I accepted the invitation, and thank you. And the context of the word terrorism in this presentation connects to state terror and Argentina. So just briefly, I will show some images about my work. That is, what you're seeing are frescoes on paper, and they are largely created by pure pigments. This is the cover of the book, The Transforming Terror. And I have done installations. So my world is indeed in the world of the visual arts. But as Susan already mentioned, a big part of my life since Argentina came back to democracy in '84 has been to be in contact with the work of the Argentine Forensic Anthropology team. My sister Patricia Bernardi is one of the founding members, and the work that has brought me closer to the team was initially taking testimonies to the survivors, working in several capacities until the work brought me also to the actual exhumation. In some occasions, I travel with the team, and there's where Mark and I met in El Salvador, for instance. But I think working in the context and in the adjacency of art and human rights, or art and war, it came forward the question of what is happening to the people who are the survivors. So my work turned into a completely different direction at one point, and although I still do my work in the studio, my own artwork, my most current work is working in community-based projects all over the world with people who are survivors of terror, survivors of massacres, survivors of torture, survivors of having been forced exile, etc. So my role as a visual artist is to ask questions. I do not do any decision. I don't take any decision. I just question what is what you want to say in this community project. And what I am astonished about in terms of the concept of transforming is that when one asks a community what is what you want, they usually have an answer. But it appears to be that no one is asking and no one is saying. But the art project in that way has been an aperture to understand what is what the communities want. Last year, and I hope this works, maybe not. Yeah, this works. Last year, I went back to Argentina, where I am from, and I proposed to the Argentine Forensic Anthropology team to create a project with survivors of state terror who are the family members of the people who disappeared. The concept of this presentation is the disappeared are appearing, and that is because through DNA testing, now all the human remains that have been under the custody of the Argentine forensic team are being DNA tested and identifications are possible. So this community project that you are about to see is a collaboration with the Argentine forensic team working with people who are relatives of the disappeared who have been able to retrieve the human remains of their loved ones through the work of the team. And let's hope sound works.
Mi propuesta es que ustedes agarren papel, lápiz y que empiecen a volcar ideas.
La restitución por ahí no la pondría como al final de todo, porque tendría que haber algo más que es lo que viene después de eso.
No sé, yo lo pensé así, como con la ronda de las madres también, que fue algo que creo que como que resume gran parte de la historia.
La situación de la recuperación de los restos, cada persona la vive de manera absolutamente diferente.
Porque en el encuentro es cuando se mezcla todo. Se mezcla el pasado, el presente, el atrás, el adelante.
Imagínense que se lo están mostrando a gente que no conoce cuál es el tema. Yo quisiera que alguno de ustedes nos presentaran el mural a todos, a los que hemos participado.
La idea del árbol era, bueno, como partir del origen de la vida anterior al terrorismo de Estado. Es decir, la vida de...
Creo que quedó muy bueno el momento de, como, no sé, la restitución o el entierro, lo que cada uno lo vio de alguna manera como una pieza importante dentro del rompecabezas. Está bueno que una de las historias esté contada a través de eso.
Le gustaba cazar y pescar, entonces iba a pescar mucho.
Siempre soñar en que él volvía por ese caminito por el que se fue al reencuentro de su familia, con su guitarra al hombro.
Y yo creo que después de abrazar a nuestros huesitos y de encontrar justicia, todo visto de nuevo, visto renovación, es alegría, es música, es naturaleza, es salir volando.
These are the artists.
Thank you, Claudia. That was so moving. And Claudia's been working in many different places. Can I say with immigrant children, undocumented in Virginia, for instance, and with at one point with families in Juarez who, if you know about Juarez, where all the women were. So many women disappeared and they were found in graves in the desert around Juarez and had been raped and abused sexually. And so I'm mentioning that because there's a connection with, there's a line running through this presentation that reminds us that all the different ways that people suffer from terror. And Rebecca Solnit also needs no introduction, I think, but I'm going to give her one anyway. She's prolific, brilliant, engaged writer and historian, author of 17 books about geography, community, art, politics, hope, and feminism, and weaves things together in a way that is quite extraordinary so that you come up with new understandings of what's going on. One of her latest books is Men Explain Things to Me, which is one, so it's delightful, that particular essay, and the whole book is very powerful. And in it, she has an essay about domestic violence and rape, yes. And I just want to mention some of her earlier books because these things are all connected. She wrote a book called Savage Dreams about the atomic testing, the nuclear testing in Nevada, and protesting it. I wrote a book called A Chorus of Stones about nuclear warfare. Nuclear warfare, as Dan Ellsberg will tell you, and as the essay that I wrote in Transforming Terror argues, is a form of terrorism. It's aimed at civilians. It's aimed at non-combatants. And so all these things are connected, and I'm going to, and also I just have to mention that Rebecca has written these series of, as well as writing a field guide to getting lost, she's also written actual guides to various cities, San Francisco.
Oh, the atlases, yes.
The atlases, yeah. They're really quite wonderful, imaginative, and marvelous, and a whole new, deeper look at where we live. I'm going to turn it over to, I'm going to turn this, just a quote from Rape a Minute, 1,000 Corpses a Year. Here in the United States, where there is a reported rape every 6.2 minutes, and 1 in 5 women will be raped in their lifetime, the rape and gruesome murder of a young woman on a bus in New Delhi on December 16th was treated as an exceptional incident. So I just, the way that Rebecca puts things into perspective is really a treasure to all of us.
We're going to get to the feminism, but I wanted to start by talking about terror by saying the curious thing about 9/11 is that the people who were there weren't actually terrified. Terror is something usually manufactured, as I think Claudia's work references, not by people far away, but often by our own governments to control us. And in Argentina, they were using the idea that communism was a threat and et cetera, to try, to justify a totalitarian regime. I did a book called A Paradise Built in Hell about how people respond in disasters. And I looked at natural disasters like the 1906 earthquake, but I also looked at 9/11, and I've met people and interviewed them and read probably about 200 oral histories of people who were inside the trade towers when the planes hit. Nobody was terrified, and nobody in the immediate aftermath was terrified. Were any of you terrified? I was, I think a lot of people I know here were terrified about what our government was going to do. People were astonished and they were grieved and things like that. But the people, that terrorism also is something that states, and I think we should call mass bombings of civilians terrorism too. And what was interesting when I did A Paradise Built in Hell is that one of the disasters I wrote about was how Londoners responded to the Blitz. There's a theory when aerial bombing became possible that's really a theory of human nature, that we're so fragile and timorous that you can terrorize us and we'll sort of fall apart. And so the Blitz, and we had equivalent things with German cities, et cetera. The mass aerial bombing of civilians was supposed to cause a complete social breakdown because everybody would be so terrified they'd cease to function. And it would undermine morale and everything would collapse. It didn't work in Vietnam, as Jonathan Schell has written so beautifully. It didn't work in Central America or South America. It didn't work with London or Dresden. during World War II. And it didn't really work in that way in 9/11. And what happened immediately afterwards is they worked very hard at inculcating terror in us, they being the Bush administration, and telling us to be terrified. And it was very odd, as I remember afterwards, the way that people in like remote places, you know, there's been all this funding to police departments, which should become our new instruments of terror. You know, they get tanks and things as though, you know, this small town in Idaho is going to be the site of the next Al-Qaeda attack. And so there's a question of like, what are the actual dangers that face us in this country? Because terrorism, and more people are killed by toddlers with guns in this country than are killed by terrorists, at least in recent years. Yeah, and I think that instead that the kind of stuff that happened in 9/11 was a threat not to the actual physical well-being of the great majority of us, although a few thousand people tragically died, but it was a threat to a sort of macho sense of identity on the part of the government and its sense of being in control. 80 Americans are killed by guns every day. More than 3 women a day are killed by intimate partner violence. We have tremendous environmental problems. Climate change is the most terrifying and huge problem we've ever faced. And it's interesting looking at why we don't address these other ones. And some of it is that they implicate us. A lot of it is that they don't particularly demand what governments want to do anyway, which is to aggrandize power and control their citizenry. And some of them, I think, demand the opposite. That instead that you have an empowered civil society, an open conversation, a democratic participatory process, et cetera. Certainly climate change requires recognizing that we're interconnected, et cetera. But I just wanted to say something about when I say more than 3 women a day are murdered by partners, and it was only a few years after 9/11 that more women had been killed in intimate partner violence than had been killed by Al-Qaeda. And, you know, it's more than people who are killed by police. It's more than, you know, a lot of these categories that we do address. And the invisibility of it is about the fact that we like to talk about violence when it's done by them. We're not so eager to talk about violence when it's a version of us. And domestic violence, you know, is familial violence, it's intimate violence, it's pervasive violence, it's rich as well as poor, people of all colors in all parts of the country. But addressing it would require addressing the most fundamental structure of power over the last several thousand years in our culture, which is patriarchy. Before there was capitalism, before there was racism, there was patriarchy. And, you know, the reasons why women get killed, you know, as part of that conversation, the assumption that you have the right to control someone so much that you even have the right to control whether they live or die, which is the authoritarianism always implicit in violence. But before those 3 women a day are killed, many of them live for years and decades in terror. You know, I'm trying to remember what I was reading. I read so much of this. You know, I've come across this stuff every day, but women, you know, I met a woman when I was teaching at a university in the Rocky Mountain part of the country who lived in a gated community because her ex-husband had been hunting her for more than a decade, and she had to spend her whole life, you know, being like Leon Trotsky in Mexico or something, preparing for her own assassination and trying to prevent it. And, you know, there's millions of women like her. And the fact that we live in a culture that has structures in almost every city called domestic violence shelters, I mean, how fucking crazy is it? And hopefully we'll say in 500 years, those were the bad years. Those were years where we had institutional structures for women to hide from men because men were so homicidal. Not all of you, but enough of you. And, you know, and Mark's definition of terrorism as premeditated violence against non-combatants usually intended to influence an audience is a pretty good definition of domestic violence. And I also think about it because, you know, I think climate is more important than anything else. But when I think of how many women's lives are taken, but also wasted, when I think of how much of my life has been wasted figuring out every day of my life what to do not to get raped, something you know, since I was for the last 40 years, since I was 13, you know, not getting raped has been one of my hobbies and avocations, as it has been probably for every woman in this room, and stuff. And you know, and it's like it's hard to be a good climate activist or a good anything when that, and it takes up huge amount, living under a regime of terror takes up a huge amount of energy on the part of most of the women in most of the cultures on the earth. And it's a kind of terrorism that I think we've started to talk about in the last few years in this incredibly exciting, renewed conversation when Susan was part of with the kind of first great flourishing or explosion of it with feminism in the 60s and 70s. But I really want to see us put the kind of political violence that is actually fairly small scale, except, we haven't had a major terrorist incident in this country since 9/11. We can't have 4 in 1. We haven't really had a lot before. School shootings have probably killed significantly more people. And there are those 80 people a day killed by handguns. A lot of them suicides, but some of them accidents, like all those toddlers who are more dangerous than terrorists to us at this moment. But a lot of them also homicides. So I think that I want to see I want to see us recognize political violence in a landscape of violence that includes environmental violence and domestic violence when we have these conversations. And I think that domestic violence is a terrorism that needs to be addressed as such.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Yes. So, I'm going to just... I don't know. So, 10 minutes, right? Okay. So I'm going to just take a few minutes for us to respond as panelists and then open up for questions from you. But I'm going to throw out a comment here from Karl Ove Nusgaard, who had a piece in the New Yorker recently about Breivik, the man who murdered so many people on an island off of Norway, and the whole country was completely shocked. Nothing like that had ever happened. But he spoke in that article about something that I have encapsulated as a culture of violence. And then I was on Truthdig. Do you know that website? Bob Shear's wonderful website. And apparently Bob and Chris Hedges are now also talking about a culture of violence. And feminists, I think, have been talking about a culture of violence for a long time. So I really think that there's a possibility that we can use, the government, of course, is using terrorism as a pivot to fight war, but maybe we, the people, can start to use terror and terrorism to look at the substructure of a culture of violence and create a real change. How do we create that change? Anyway, I'm going to open it up to see if anybody has comments on that or anything else you may wish to say.
Something in the context of Argentina again. I mean, what I presented is the effect of state terror. And one monumental change in the history of Argentina is the identifying that exactly was the case, that this was state terror produced, manufactured, and put in place by the military junta. So a big change of Argentine history in recent years is that there are over 700 military men who have been put on trial and given very important convictions, some of which are life in prison. Just recently, last week, Luciano Benjamin Menendez, who is one of the great repressors, one of the most violent ones, has been given the 12 consecutive life in prison sentence. For Argentines, it's very different to say life in sentence than to count each and all the deaths that he caused. I believe the United States could look at that as inspiration.
I think one of the things we know from history is that terror provokes counter-terror. I mean, that is very frequently what happens. It happened in Argentina. It happened throughout the Southern Cone in Central America. It happened in the United States, and we're still living in that era. I agree with Rebecca that the government has used this to dominate the conversation, dominate its own preferences when it comes to civil rights and when it comes to expanding government power. We've seen that. We all know about it. I wish that the issue was revealing it In other words, I wish that if we just made that public, then something would be done about it. In fact, it's very public, just the way torture has been very public for a decade or more, and we are still living with it. I think that to go I mean, first of all, I thought Claudia's presentation was very beautiful and hopeful, and it also reminded me that, especially by the comments she just made, that sometimes changing this takes decades. Sometimes changing this takes decades, which is an amazing thing and can either make you hopeful or not, depending on your particular disposition. I found Rebecca's remarks extremely moving and disturbing. I think we have an immensely violent society. H. Rap Brown, I think it was, who said violence is as American as cherry pie, not apple pie. And indeed, it is an immensely violent society, and what unceasingly moves me and strikes me is our ability to get used to things and to not see what is in front of our faces. And the effort to actually show people what's in front of their faces doesn't have to do simply with showing them. It has to do with showing them, showing them, showing them again. And eventually you perhaps start to get a conversation, which I think, to again get to a hopeful note here, we're starting to see now. Whether this will provoke real change, I don't know. But it certainly won't happen without it.
You know, some of the great, and this Argentinian story is so remarkable in so many ways, and the resistance of Las Madres de la Playa de Mayo, the mothers who marched when everybody else was afraid, is remarkable. And I think that this is a panel in relationship to a book called Transforming Terror. And I spent a lot of time in New Orleans, which is a really violent place, and I've thought about what is the opposite of violence. And New Orleans also has that, which is this sort of joyous public celebration of living coexisting in public. And Argentina had that in an extraordinary way when the economy collapsed in 2001, a few months after 9/11. You know, it was kind of the anti-terrorism moment where people came out into the streets. And my friend Marina Citrin, who spent a lot of time there and is Mark Danner's cousin, but she's you know, maybe brilliance runs in the family, has talked about how that was the moment a lot of people overcame the fear of the dictatorship. They were so outraged by the, you know, the financial situation that they were utterly fearless. And I think that the opposite of terror is these civic moments. In a way, a book festival is a very small, calm one, but these moments where people coexist in public, and that democracy is based on a sense of trust in ourselves and each other, and across difference and inclusion of more people than you just know in your private life. It's a kind of living in public, and the state terror drives us into private life, and in a way is another part of the privatization of neoliberalism. And so I think that transforming terror is coming to live again as a member of civil society and to make a society in which people have agency and voice and confidence and freedom from violence. And that's an important part of this conversation.
It's fabulous. Thank you. That's beautiful. I think we have time for one question. Okay. Yeah. Yes. Yes, we were. The CIA was training. Yeah.
What in our country is allowing us to shut our eyes to that, at the same time being so much part of our DNA?
Well, I think that's, you know, I think there are many different answers to that, but part of it is the social inequalities, the racism, for instance, the sexism that we live with, also blinds us to the atrocities we commit, because that goes hand in hand. You know, if you have a habit of denial, denying what the real power structures are doing to people right here domestically, you know, so that's one answer. But it's a good question. Anybody else have an answer?
I just say, your question arises from an assumption which is that you have a citizenry, the citizenry acts reliably to make the government act in right fashion abroad, in a morally upright fashion in what it does in foreign affairs. And I think you can look at all the empires in history and fail to see an example of that. And the U.S., since the Second World War, has been an imperial power, and a neo-imperial, whatever you'd like to call it, and has tended to act abroad in its interests in a rather ruthless way. I don't like to say that the U.S. was behind the Argentinian terror or behind the Chilean terror. The U.S. certainly was collaborating with those governments, there's no question about it, but I always think that it's better to give the governments themselves credit as well, rather than acting as if they were agents of the United States, because that usually isn't the way it works. But, you know, even today, there is now another war going on with the Islamic State. The president unilaterally declared it in September. Congress refuses to vote on it, even though the president has now repeatedly asked them to vote on it. So we have governmental institutions, and it is not as if there is a demand on the part of the people that this be debated publicly. There isn't. I think Americans in general aren't that interested in foreign affairs. They're not that well informed. Those who govern us are perfectly aware of that. The one thing they're concerned about is when planes come out of the sky and destroy buildings and kill 3,000 people as they're starting work in the morning. And that gives a kind of long-lasting fear on which you can build substantial government policy. But I don't think Americans in general care that much about what goes on abroad and what the government is doing.
And yet I think that people can come to care, have in certain instances, and that can happen. So the big question is, how do we make them care? How do we make ourselves care? And yes.
So thank you guys so
I'm
much. I know we
sorry.
could continue this for like another 2 hours at least. So I am going to bring the authors outside to Alston. We'll be doing a signing out there.
Thank you to
if you
all
could
the
clear the room
panelists.
going out the back door
Thank you
here.
to the
And thank you guys so much. Let's give them a big round of applause.